If you find yourself in a room full of Spanish speakers from all over the world, and you suddenly feel the urge to see them argue among themselves, that is, if they're not already arguing over soccer or whether Enrique Iglesias looks better with or without his face wart, just ask them which country speaks the most neutral form of Spanish, and watch the entire room erupt into patriotic chaos. Some will probably argue that, since Spain invented the language, their version is the closest one can get to the original form of Spanish, and therefore should be considered the most neutral, which is sort of right, but in practical terms, the largest number of Spanish speakers reside in the Americas and don't speak with the old world Spanish accent.
Muchas fuentes cibernéticas diarias. Todo el mundo opinando. Un caos.
So is there a neutral, and if not neutral, at least generic form of Spanish that's widely understood by everyone? Yes, that type of Spanish exists, and all Spanish speakers are familiar with it, but don't love it. Just like Enrique Iglesias' face wart, and his music.
Es casi una experiencia religiosa, sentir que resucito si me tocas, subir al firmamento prendido de tu cuerpo, es una experiencia religiosa.
Welcome to another episode of Bad Hombres. We're Latin Americans who like to seriously analyze culture through frivolous observations, and today we're discussing the history, practicality, and shortcomings of what passes as neutral Spanish. Yes, a neutral form of Spanish exists, and it's understood by most Spanish speakers, though oddly it's not consistently spoken or even liked by people who communicate through the most romantic out of all of the Romance languages. That's right, we can confidently say that Spanish is a lot more romantic than French or Italian because everyone knows that Spanish-speaking countries make the best telenovelas, and overreacting to everything that happens in life is a clear sign of, yes, mental health issues, but also the fact that we know how to love harder than our pasta-eating or baguette-baking relatives. Anyway, before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the Bad Hombres channel, but remember to click on the bell and the all notification, otherwise YouTube will not tell you when we've uploaded new content. Just like flan or the tres leches cake, nowadays every Spanish-speaking country seems to have their own version of neutral Spanish, which is usually the type of Spanish that's mainly spoken in capital cities. Spain's neutral Spanish, for example, sounds like the average Madrileño accent, not just because Madrid is the capital, but because that's where a lot of the country's media is produced. However, for the purposes of this video, we're focusing on the most recognizable form of neutral Spanish by the largest number of Spanish speakers, meaning everyone who populates the American continent, including yours truly, because we outnumber Spanish speakers from Europe by a lot. And that type of Spanish is, at its roots, a bland version of Mexican Spanish. Mexicans don't actually speak this type of Spanish because it's manufactured and not an organic combination of old world Spanish with native languages, but we'll dig deeper into that in a little bit. For now, just know that this type of Spanish is colloquially known as news anchor Spanish, Español Latino, or Español Neutro, and it sounds like this.
¿Quién es o qué es el chupacabras? Pues hoy por primera vez ustedes tendrán algunas respuestas concretas.
Even if you don't understand Spanish, you can probably tell the tone is serious, sober, and monotone, just like a catechism teacher. Except these reporters don't get to beat you with a wooden ruler whenever you stop paying attention to them. Yes, Mexicans invented this accent for the same reason that they invented Taco Bell, which is to sell a shitty product to Americans while keeping the good stuff to themselves. I'm just kidding. Although some Mexicans, specifically the ones that work in the film industry, did come up with this accent during World War II, during a period which is now called the Golden Age of Mexican cinema. According to Tamara Falikov, a film professor from the University of Kansas, back then Hollywood was actually heavily involved in Mexican cinema. They helped train technicians, film crews, and actors, not out of the kindness of their heart or because they wanted to steal real taco recipes, although I wouldn't put that past them, but because Hollywood executives wanted Mexico to adapt American content for the rest of Latin America, such as Disney films.
Y ahora, una fórmula para transformar mi belleza en fealdad y así poder ocultar mi porte real y convertirme en pordiosera.
But to many Spanish speakers, this type of Spanish comes off as artificial, stripped of its peculiarities, and unnatural, kinda like Sammy Sosa's new face. Still, Mexican studios developed what they thought sounded like a neutral accent, and they probably knew it wasn't pretty, but the point was for it to be understandable by most Spanish speakers, unlike Casey Affleck's Spanish.
Película Out of the Furnace, como se dice en español, fuera del forno.
En el suelo la noche se ilumina, el silencio se vuelve melodía y es...
Since it has the largest number of Spanish speakers in the world, is its neighbor, and it already had a robust film industry, asking Mexico to adapt its content seems like an obvious choice for Hollywood, but it wasn't the only choice. Argentina, for example, also had a very successful film industry. However, unlike Mexico or Brazil, the two Latin American countries who sent troops overseas during World War II, Argentina stayed largely neutral, and that pissed off the American government. Yes, the feigned neutral Mexican Spanish we all love to hate could have been feigned neutral Argentinian Spanish, but the Americans suspected that some Argentinian studios were producing pro-Axis propaganda, and one studio, Argentina's Sono Film, was culpable. So they banned shipments of raw film stock to the tango-loving country and instead threw the film work over to Mexico. This might seem strange to younger people, but back then the United States actually fought against Nazis, unlike in recent times, now that they appear to be practically sanctioned by the American government.
But you also had people that were very fine people on both sides.
Vuelve pronto, mi amor, te necesito ya.
While it's no longer the case, since you can now hire dubbing services in Colombian Spanish or the Old World variety, for years Mexico certainly had a monopoly not just on dubbing but on all things media. That's because in addition to films and TV shows, Mexico began producing soap operas. The main producer of these telenovelas was Televisa, currently the largest media company in all of Latin America, which even runs its own acting school called CEA, an acronym for Centro de Educación Artística. This CEA school has a very understated but strong influence in what we currently know as neutral Spanish, because they're notorious for neutralizing the accent of any actor, TV host, or news anchor who hopes to work within Televisa's massive ecosystem. And at least back in the day, that used to be a lot of people. Looking back, they're probably deeply embarrassed by it, understandably, and you'll see why. But some of Latin America's biggest stars actually got their feet wet in one of Televisa's many cheesy shows. For example,
Estaba recordando, mira, haciendo un recuento de todo lo que ha pasado en nuestras vidas, Jessy.
Cuando no éramos nadie.
Ahí está.
Tu mujer te mantuvo todo el tiempo que estuvieron casados. Tú mismo me lo dijiste.
Sí, pero no era igual.
Yo también te puedo dar un cheque mensual y ya. ¿Cuál es el problema?
Soy Salma Hayek, tengo 20 años, estoy en el primer grupo del segundo año del centro de capacitación y no tengo ninguna experiencia. Aquí estoy y aquí estás.
Groundbreaking.
the important takeaway here isn't that Televisa produces incredibly corny programming, although that's certainly true, but that through its CEA school, they methodically forced many actors, news anchors, or anybody who wanted to appear on their network, which again used to be a lot of people, to speak in their own version of neutral Spanish. There's two key moments in the history of neutral Spanish in the US, and surprise, they're connected to the way Televisa penetrated the US's market. The first moment happened in 1961, when Emilio Azcárraga, the owner of Telesistema Mexicano, aka Televisa, before it was called Televisa, bought KCOR-TV, the first Spanish-language TV station in the US. Emilio realized that Latino audiences were growing in the United States and that Spanish-language media would soon be needed to entertain them. So over the years, Azcárraga and his partners acquired various American stations, which would later become known as the Spanish International Network, or SIN. Although it would have been much cooler for a network called SIN to entertain its Spanish speakers using hot and sexy content, in 1987 SIN was rebranded as Univision, a network that got most of its content from, you guessed it, Televisa, which is about as sexy as listening to your boring conservative parents talk about sex. However, Univision's launch was the second pivotal moment for news anchor Spanish in the US because, although Televisa supplemented the network with most of its content, Univision's national newscast, along with local affiliate newscasts, had to be produced in the US. And that's because it doesn't make any logistical sense to have another country, in this case Mexico, producing local newsy content for stations in America. That meant that news anchors in Florida, Texas, Chicago, New York, Los Angeles, all of whom were an eclectic mix of Spanish speakers, needed to be understood by an even more eclectic group of viewers. That's where Televisa's accent-neutralizing SEA tricks came in handy. Reporters and news anchors working for Univision were trained to speak in the SEA style of flat, boring, neutral Spanish.
En Bruselas, los dirigentes de la OTAN logran acuerdo para negociar con la Unión Soviética la reducción de cohetes de corto alcance.
And audiences probably didn't love it, but eventually became accustomed to it, just like we all became accustomed to Enrique Iglesias' word-free face.
You want a wiener with no bread?
Since multiculturalism is very much in vogue nowadays, this seems like the perfect time for mainstream media to embrace Spanish in all of its flavors, intonations, and enunciations. Because wouldn't it be better to hear Jorge Ramos say, El Cheto dice puras mamadas, güey, instead of Donald Trump es una persona conflictiva? Or to hear 90s Primer Impacto icon Mirka de Llanos say, Ya tú sabes, instead of Así como lo intuyes. I think it would be better and funnier. Also, please bring back Mirka de Llanos to national TV. Well, traitor for Jorge Ramos. However, even if it sounds garish, it is true that neutral Spanish can serve a legitimate function, which is clarity. And that's because, at this point, at least in America, everyone who speaks Spanish understands it. And that can make it useful for certain tasks such as passing along technical information. For example, a printer's instructions, because nobody outside of Spain calls a computer an ordenador.
Si supieran mis coetáneos que escribo con un ordenador, fliparían, como dicen ustedes.
Plus, making fun of neutral Spanish has even become a genre on YouTube.
Lo entiendo porque tengo el IQ suficiente. Desconozco cuál sea, pero es irrelevante. Me despido, soy una persona normal.
So, no. It's probably not gonna die out soon. Anyway, that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the Bad Hombres channel, and we'll see you soon. Ciao.
Es casi una experiencia religiosa, sentir que resucito si me tocas, subir al firmamento prendido de tu cuerpo, es una experiencia religiosa.